You're on.
It is now July, what's that?
July 11th.
July 11th, 2016. Okay? We're headed north from down below the hospital in Bristol towards the city of Bristol. The purpose of this trip is to review the history of part of the family, that is the Coffey and Straley part. And that goes way back in the late 1600s and early 1700s, and some of the original pioneers and some of the original people that come to the United States on the eastern coast of Virginia. Later, we get to King College, we're going to review the history of the other part of the family besides the Coffeys and Straleys, and that will be the Cosbys, okay? And the Cosbys, Eula, and Eula will tell us a few things, and later we will make another one of these for the Cosby family. The next part of this family is the Burns clan, and they're up in Baltimore, and they are with us in the form of my daughter Carol Burns, whose birthday will be on July the 14th, and her one daughter, Alana, and her son, Brian. And so, Alana, how old are you?
12.
12. And Brian is 14.
Yeah.
And so here we head towards Bristol. Now first we'll tell a little bit of the story of how we got here. We all came as Scotch-Irish. Now, actually, the Straleys were German, and we're not sure exactly how they got here, but they came into Virginia in the really early part and came up into the mountain areas, the plateaus of Virginia, the highlands they call it, several thousand feet, and they came out of the New River Valley. The New River Valley is a large settlement pushed into the Indian Territory. Now we return to the Scotch-Irish Coffeys. Turns out the Scots could not be subdued, and so everybody hated them. The English hated them, and the English pushed into Ireland, and they pushed the Scots up into Ireland, and they got the name Scotch-Irish. The Irish hated them, and so they dominated them, and every time they made an error, they'd arrest them. And if they didn't pay their bills, they'd turn them into white slaves called Indentured Servants. And they'd have to work several years for their master, and then when they got through and paid off their debt, which they told them what it was, they were just sent out. And they were usually given a cow or a little teeny bit of land, which is a peach nothing land, not the pretty part of Virginia, where the Piedmont belt is, where the lords sent their companies over. And they were Lord Baltimore and Lord Calvert and all these big lords of England who never came to the United States. They wanted to make money over here, and there were two countries that were big on this. One were the Spanish, which when they left Europe went south, and they opened up South America and all the gold and destroyed the Indian tribes down there in South America, Chile and Brazil and all, and they came back with all the gold. And then they pushed up through Florida, went across into Mexico, and came up the east coast, the west coast, San Francisco, San Diego, Nevada, New Mexico, and they pushed hard up that side. The English, meanwhile, pushed up the east coast, and these were the King of England, George III, and he pushed up into the United States of Virginia, Pennsylvania, Boston, all the New England, Maine, and into Canada, and they called all that for the Queen. Meanwhile, the French, who got into the game, pushed up the middle part of the United States, and starting at New Orleans, they pushed up, and that later became the Louisiana Purchase, all the way up into St. Louis, and all the French were in there. Now, the Spanish, the French, and the English hated each other. So when the English got here, they found no gold, no treasures. They only found rocks and wood. And this has a lot to do with your family. Everything that your family did on the coffee side was related to the only resource they had available. They were pushed into the mountains. Now, the king only was interested in tobacco, Piedmont, North Carolina, Richmond, those beautiful areas. Nobody gave a damn about those real high mountains. And people who went up there were called over the hill crowd. And they didn't belong to anybody. And they were the Scotch-Irish who hated the English and hated all this group, and they hated them. And they pushed over in several places. The first big place is Elizabethton, Tennessee, which we will soon go to. And Elizabeth, Tennessee is the first democratic government in the world. They hated the king, and all the people here who were part of the king's group are called Whigs. And all the people up in the mountain were just called a bunch of hillbillies. And so those people up in the mountain had to push the Indians out. They had to really fight for existence in log cabins and had a terrible, hard life. There's nothing you can grow up there. And all they had was wood and religion and a little bit of making moonshine and alcoholic beverages and things, and corn, and some tobacco. So they lived in little teeny settlements. And the only thing that held them together was their religion. If they were Baptists, they gathered together. If they were Methodists. So the earliest Straley, one of the earliest ones, not the earliest one, was a preacher who rode on a horse from community to community to baptize, bury, marry, do all those things. And so he was a preacher on a horse called a circuit rider. And Reverend J.O. Straley was a circuit rider. Now, he came late in this game, and meaning that 1690 and 1700s and 1750s, that was before George Washington. And then, when we got our freedom, George Washington became president. And he wasn't too happy with that crowd up in the mountain and came up to make them pay taxes. And there was the Risky Rebellion, which they refused to pay any taxes. And so here are these independent mountain people who the Indians hated and massacred and killed because they didn't believe in any property rights. They left this to nature. You couldn't own that land. That belonged to the tribe. But there wasn't just one Indian. There's about 5 tribes. One of the big ones is the Sequoia tribe, the Cherokees, and these the Shawnee. And they fought amongst themselves for 1,000 years before we got here. So now we're pushing into their hunting grounds. And up here around Bristol and above it was loaded with buffalo. There were so many buffalo, they darkened the land up here. And there's plenty of meat and plenty of food. And each of the tribes had the area they hunted. So it was their hunting area that they protected. So, with that background, in comes the people moving from Scotland. And they took over the hunting grounds. And that's what started the war. Well, very quickly, the French believed that they armed the American Indians, they could push the English out of the East Coast. So they came in and armed and gave guns because the Indians had no guns. They didn't even have many horses back then. And they armed them up, and it's the French and Indian War. And into that came people like George Washington fighting, William Penn, Pennsylvania, etc. But the Indians were really furious against Elizabeth because somebody came over and said, we'll give you this whole east part of Tennessee. And it was the Indian chief. And it wasn't really his land. And the Indians who really thought it was their land decided to kill everybody here. And there was big massacres. And up in New River, which is further north, way up there, and you'll see it when you go through Pulaski and Draper Mountain. The Draper Meadows were highlands. Now it's hard to believe that you're right now at 1,600 feet as we ride to Bristol. Bristol's in the highlands. It's like Scotland. It and it's not like Richmond, which is down there sea level. So up here's the sign that says Whitful, 61 miles, and Abingdon, 7 miles. And that's where Granddaddy Straley was a circuit rider in the old days in Whitful. He ended his life at the end. He died very young, but he ended his life working for the church and being in Abingdon and raising money for Emory and Henry College. He was considered one of the greatest preachers around. And if you hit the Google and you hit Reverend James O. Straley or J.O. Straley, all of this information from the conference in this area, in the Holston Mountains, was called the Holston Conference for the Methodists. And he was the head of that, J.O. Straley was, until he got up and preached that children who died and weren't baptized could go to heaven. And that's not what the Methodist Church believes. And they told him if he ever preached that again, he could never preach again, and he'd lose being the head of the Holston Conference. The next week he got up, gave the sermon again, and they threw him out. But they knew he was so great, they gave him an administrative job of raising money for Emory and Henry College. There were no colleges in those days in this area. So he was very influential in helping build it. And there's a room in Emory and Henry, which is about 40 miles north of where we are now, between Whitful and Abingdon, where Emory and Henry exists today. A lot of famous people went through this little college, and I used to play basketball against them. And this little Emory and Henry College has a room for Reverend J.O. Straley. Now, he was an orphan in here at some time, and we have no idea how his mother and father were killed, if they were killed by the Indians or what. But then one of his children died, and they're buried up here, and he had several others. And he had a man named, his children were James Straley and Aunt Maddie, my mother, May, Irene, and I think I said it, Eula. Is there 3 or 4? Donna, it ain't Donna. So there were 4 girls and 1 boy. And they had moved,
Straleys.
yeah, and they had moved to Bristol from Whitful to open a church here. Now remember, he was 10 years younger than your father. And so he moved here, and in his 40s, he preached at the Reynolds Memorial Church, which we will show you. And Reynolds, look at that gun on it.
Yeah.
Reynolds Memorial was a man who made lots of tobacco, the Duke tobacco, and it was made in Bristol. And he convinced him that tobacco was bad, and he gave his money and left and made Reynolds Aluminum, I understand, which got out of the tobacco bill. And some of the other people continued the Duke over where it's Duke University in North Carolina, where there's lots of tobacco. So this was big tobacco country, and it moved out. It moved into North Carolina. And the Reynolds Memorial Church was the Methodist church. And of course, that's the Straleys. And then he dies of a stroke. And who's going to feed the children? There was no Social Security or anything. So, turns out the church bought 3 little grubby houses down a hill I'm going to show you, and gave them to the widow, who was my grandmother. I never saw my grandfather. I never saw my grandmother. And that's the Straley side. And on the Coffee side, I never saw my grandfather Coffee. My grandmother Coffee, who was a live wire, and she was a rucker, a very famous family in Virginia. And she'd been married before to a man who was a doctor, and he dropped dead. And then she married my grandfather. And they lived in a little place called Alto, Virginia, called Coffee Town, in Nelson County, Virginia, right in the center of Virginia. And they were up there in those mountains, because when the early Coffees were indentured servants.
Are you going into Abingdon?
No. Where am I?
Well, you're way north of